join me in welcoming Hugo.
Thank you. That is bright. Hey, hi. I'll get started in just a second. And wait, this is a clicker. Excellent. I have a question of the utmost importance to ask you. So, if we can just turn the light on in the room just for a couple of seconds. And cool. Thank you very much. Thanks. Hey, hi. It's a lot of people. Yeah, I have a friend in Berlin, Andrea, and she believes that pineapple on a pizza is a good thing. And I would like your opinion on this. So if you think that pineapple on a pizza is okay, raise your hand. Holy shit! Man! Okay, so whoever said yes, I respect your opinion. Know that you are wrong and misguided. You can leave now. For the rest of you, we'll just get started. I've been asked not to move too much on the scene, on the stage, and this is very hard for me. Let me show you, because when I'm on stage, I'm just like a cat, just running around like this, and then really not happy about it. So I'll just try to stay around here. So, right, the presentation has been made. I work at N26. I've been also asked to tell you that we hire. So if you fancy a career in Berlin, we hire all kind of profiles. So hit me up, and we'll see what we can do. I'm being an accessibility advocate means that, practically speaking, I'm a front-end developer, but it means I focus a lot on accessibility and inclusivity across our products. So let me get started with this. I'm going to start with a story about the title, because I think it's a bit confusing. And I traveled with my best friend. He's here today, and we went to From the Front last year in September. A wonderful conference, and as part of the conference, I was speaking there, and I booked in my contact list the name of one of the organizers, Marco, and to find him quickly, I booked Marco From the Front. And when it came back to finding the number of Marco to call him at some point, for whatever reason, it turns out that it took me a long time, and you might have guessed it, but Marco was at F, like Marco. It was at front, comma, Marco from the. So the engineer that built this contact list and ordering system thought that, one, it was a good idea to order on last name, and two, it was a good idea to split after the last space and consider everything else the family name. And when you think about it, that's quite a fucked up system. Like this is not how it works. This is not how any of this works. But my friend said something that stayed as a kind of a running gag since then. It's like clever, comma, stop being so. Hence the name of the talk today. And it boils down to asking information online or on software in general, because this is really hard. Like we give a lot of information all the time online, but it's hard to do it properly. It's hard to do it because sooner or later you will just face yourself with a problem of inclusivity and diversity. And let me break it down for you. We are all terrible at it. We all suck at this. Even like big companies make terrible inclusivity mistakes when asking for information online. So I'd like to talk about two things today: name and gender. The reason why I picked those two pieces of information across a lot of things I could have talked about is because it's usually the first two things you want to know or need to know about a person when you meet them. Usually you ask for the name, and then even if you don't ask for it, your brain just figures out the gender of the person. So those two pieces of information are quite critical, and this is why I would like to talk about them today. So let's start with names. We have quite a diverse conference here, a lot of people from all around the world. We have probably a lot of names and different cultures here. So usually online, when you ask for your name, you ask for your first name and your last name. Like we probably have all filled the form like this. And I'm gonna ask you to recall the last time you had a conversation like this. Hey, hi, nice to meet you. Hi, what is your first name and your last name? This is super rude. Like, don't do that. If we, if we meet today or if you meet someone new, don't do that. Don't ask for something like this. So this concept of asking first name and last name is pretty biased, pretty flawed. So I'd like to kind of challenge that, and to do that, I'm going to take you on a little wall tour, and God bless emojis to be able to have like this kind of little images without looking too much of Google. We're going to have a few stops in a few countries. We're not going to do the 200 of those for obvious reasons. And in this next 10 minutes, of course, I don't ask you to remember all of that. This is not the point. It's more like kind of try to see how names are different all over the world and how first name plus last name is really not a solid, robust idea. Our first stop will be Iceland. Wonderful country. Anyone from Iceland here? That's too bad. You know what? That's too bad. We'll send them the slides. In Iceland, the interesting thing is that they don't have a family name per se. They have what we call a patronymic. The patronymic is usually the name of your parents, usually your father, sometimes your mother in some circumstances. That is followed by either daughter, if you are born a daughter, born a girl, sorry, or a son if you're born a boy. So a woman named Björk would be named Björk Gudmundsdottir. And when it comes to addressing that woman, she would expect to be called either Björk or Björk Gudmundsdottir, but never Mrs. Gudmundsdottir, because this translates to Miss, the daughter of a man named Gudmunds. So, which again is not what you want. So the interesting thing is that, and I found it pretty fascinating, their phone book is ordered by given name. And I come from France, and the phone book has always been ordered by last name, of course. And it's such a small population that, and because they don't really have proper family name, the phone book is ordered by given name. And is this something you also have in Malaysia, where instead of daughter and son, you have bin and binti, followed by the name of your parents, usually again the father. A man called Isa would being the son of Osman, a man named Osman, would be Isa bin Osman, and would expect to be called either Isa or Isa bin Osman, or in some scenario like the bin or binti can be removed, but never Mr. Osman, because this is the name of a father. So even the idea of family name here just is not really something so strong in itself. If we move to China for a little while, they have something called the generation name. It is, if you take a name like this, Mao Zedong, it's the first part, Mao, is the family name, Ze is the generation name, and Dong is the given name. And the generation name is a name that is common to all siblings and sometimes cousins of the same family. So the parent would have a generation name of their own, then the children and cousins would have the same one, and then the next generation would have a different one, and so on and so on. And if you were to address this person in a formal context, and this is where you can judge my Chinese, you would say Mao Xianqiang, because this is the formal approach, like Mr. Mao, but never Mr. Zedong, because this is their given name. However, if you knew that person personally, you would call them Zedong, and here the generation name is part of the given name. So again, I'm asking you is how do you fit that into a form that asks for first name, last name? On top of that, China has a concept of Western name. So it's people traveling a lot in Occidental countries, or people working a lot with Occidental cultures, to facilitate the usage of their name, which is sometimes hard to pronounce for Occidental cultures. They pick their own Western name, as it's called. I knew a person in France called Jinpeng, And to keep the same ring to it, he went by Jean-Pierre. So we have the same initials, but it's a really completely French name in this scenario. Depending on whether this person is filling a form for their for legal documents or for a social profile, for instance, they would reply with a different one. In Spain now, they are, and mostly in most Hispanic countries, they have multiple names. Usually they have the name of their father and their mother. So a lady called Maria José Carreño Quiñones would be born, thanks, would be born of a Señorita Carreño, and a Señor Carreño and a Señorita Quiñones, sorry, and the first name is the one that matters, so she would expect to be called Carreño and not Quiñones. And if you come back to our Samsung, no, I didn't mean to blame any company, our terrible contact list from earlier. Thanks. Our terrible example from earlier, if you split after the last space, then it would be the wrong one, because in Hispanic culture, the first last name is the one that matters. If we go to France, and please appreciate that I didn't put Paris as the background, if you ever go to France, stop by the Alps, it's lovely. It's much better than Paris, which is a boring city. Yeah, city of love, yeah, right. So if there's nothing so interesting about French names, they're all pretty boring. But there is one thing about like French naming culture that is the fancy aristocratic particle. This is a naming convention that comes back to the time where people had lands and titles, and it's usually this de or du or de la word that you see between the given name and the last name. So, for instance, a man called Jean de Jouvencourt would absolutely not be called Monsieur Jouvencourt. Like the particle has to be part of the last name, has to be part of the family name. So in this case, it's not really that, it doesn't make it so much harder for these people to fill a form, but it definitely shows you that, for instance, spaces in names are completely okay. If we go east a bit, and in Germany, they have a strong focus on academic degrees and titles. So a doctor or a professor would be mentioned by their title in press or formal communication. So a Mr. Schmidt, for instance, would be called Herr Professor Dr. Schmidt and not just Herr Schmidt. In Japan, they have something similar with some sort of relationship context as part of a name. So if you take a Shigeru Miyamoto that you would call with a last name Miyamoto, because the given name is pretty personal, you would have this Miyamoto-san. There's several suffixes like this, depending on the context. This one is kind of the broader story. And interesting piece of trivia, the only time we can omit that is if you're a foreigner and you don't know any better. This is the only time where we'll be like, yeah, I guess it's okay. In Vietnam, the given name is a formal, is okay in formal communication. So if you take the former Prime Minister of Vietnam, Nguyen Thanh Dung, would be referred, sorry, Nguyen is the last name, Thanh the middle name, Dung is the given name, first name if you prefer. He would be referred in the press as Mr. Dung. So in Vietnam, the given name is completely okay, even in formal context. In Thailand, they use a lot of nicknames. The first woman prime minister, Yingluck Shinawatra, had as a nickname Pooh, which means crab. And the interesting part is that they really use a lot of nicknames, but even in professional contexts. Like, it's not just in Occidental culture where we have that in very intimate contexts, like family, friends, and romantic relationship. They also do that a lot in any kind of context, including a professional. And our last stop is India. And I'm gonna level up with you here. India has so many cultures and subcultures and fascinating names that I could not find solid examples to illustrate my point. So I'm just gonna list what you can find in Indian names, which is astonishing. They have family name, but they also have patronymics. Sometimes have the location as part of a name in some part of India. They also have the caste or social rank as part of the name, religion concerns, and even sometimes initials, where the name being very long in some part of India, they only take the initial of some parts and use them as a new given name, let's say. And if you want some more clusterfuck on top of all this, you have marital names that we know a lot, where the husband can take the name of the bride of the husband after a marriage. Or sometimes they keep both, sometimes they hyphenate, sometimes they don't, sometimes they change the order, right? And you have people with a single name. This is a real thing. This is not a joke, and this happens more than you would think. I worked with someone in Berlin who had just like a one name. That's it, not a first name and a last name. And you have a lot more edge cases that we can't get into today. But needless to say, this doesn't work. Like first name and last name is just not a future-proof and pattern, and it doesn't work, especially if you start having people from different ethnies and cultures, countries, regions, and so on. So what do we do with all that? I've been talking a lot, and I've been boring the pants out of you. So now comes to the real thing, like what can we do to make it better? Well, don't ask for a first name and a last name. It doesn't work. So maybe try to think of something different and don't be so restrictive here. The general consensus is that the best way is to ask for to give a unique field so that people can fill the name the way they want. And when it comes to validating, the general idea is to not do that. So don't restrict the length, because single letter, single character names absolutely exist. I've seen so many products with a restriction on a minimum of 2 letters, and I don't understand. It's not any easier. It's not any easier to store. It's not any easier to validate. It's not any easier to author. It's just, this is stupid. And also handle very long names, like very long, like 30 characters, 40 characters, 50 characters, 60 characters. And as far as I can tell, it's been a long time since I didn't do any backend and database stuff, but as far as I can tell, anywhere up to 255, you're gonna store it all the same. So it's not any easier to store a 20 letters name or a 60 letters name. If I'm wrong, please come back after and just like teach me some things. Don't restrict the characters. This is very hard because Unicode is insanely large, and like then it can be harder to store any kind of character. So handle everything you can, if you can handle everything, but handle everything you can, including punctuation. This is kind of a very rookie mistake to just banish any kind of punctuation like spaces, dots, commas, quote marks, hyphens, whatever else, like apostrophes. People all over the world use punctuations as part of a name. You can't just like forbid them. And by all means, I'm begging you, never say to someone the name is invalid. This is so rude. It's like you ask someone for the name, they reply with a name that is quite complex and say, it must be invalid, didn't get it. Like, no, by all means, don't do that. This is so rude. So rather say, even if it's not ideal to admit that, rather say that you can't really handle it properly, like for whatever reason, you don't have to go into technical details. So maybe ask for an alternative in Latin characters if it's what you need. All in all, don't try to be too clever with that, hence the title of the talk once again, and ask how you should call people. So if you do some research on that and have a look around, and if you even read the W3's specification, they would tell you that the best way to handle names in an international context, and I think even in any kind of context, is to have a unique field for the full name. People can fill it the way they want, with any kind of character, any kind of length. This is kind of the legal information that you need to have somewhere about the user. And then another field to let people define how they should be called in communication. So in emails, on their dashboard, or something like this. In this scenario, you can maybe say we need something in a reasonable length because we want to display it correctly on the screen, so maybe restricting to 20 or 30 characters seems legit on this kind of thing. So first name and last name is definitely something popular enough that it's, everybody kind of agrees implicitly with that, but as you can see, it's not really the best way to handle that for a lot of reasons. And we have a similar concern with gender. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk a bit about gender, and because this is a very difficult topic. This is something, names are hard, but names are hard, and in most scenarios, you're not going to offend anyone. It's really not ideal, but most people with a name that is difficult enough to not put in first name, last name, found a way to do it over the years, because we all suck at that. But gender can quickly turn out quite critical. Our society is really based on a binary conception of gender. You have a male and female, that's it. And we've seen, like, for hundreds of years that it is a very wrong concept. We want it to work like this because it's easy enough, but this is extremely wrong and extremely exclusive. So I've realized, after working with a lot of clients on a lot of different projects over the years, that what's the first bit that people don't really get is the terminology behind it. And I tried to make it did a lot of research on that as well, and tried to make it as kind of straightforward as possible. So on one hand, you have chromosomes, XX, XY, XX, XXY, and if I'm not mistaken, some more. So this is really the one end of the spectrum, which you don't care about. Like usually, I've never seen a form online that asks for my chromosomes, and I hope I never will. Then you have sexual characteristics. So usually before, but essentially during puberty, you have sexual characteristics appearing, so facial hair, Adam apple, breasts, genitals, and so on. Then you have the gender identity, which is a broad saying to describe how a person expresses their gender up to the world. And finally, the thing sorry, it was gender expression, my bad. And finally, you have the gender identity, which is really the thing that trumps everything else, and usually the thing that you care about. This is the question that you ask, like, is this person a man, a woman, non-binary, agender, and so on and so on. Followed with this terminology section, we have to kind of debunk a few misconceptions about all that. The very first one, and one of the most critical part of it, is that gender is not binary. Like, you can try to make this happen as much as you want. This is not going to happen. Like, gender is not a binary thing. Even sex is not binary. A lot of people every year are born intersex. Intersex is a person that doesn't stick to the, on a biological basis to the binary model of male and female. So if sex is not binary, gender cannot be. That's as simple as that. Gender won't ever be binary. And speaking of that, gender and sex are different. You would use the word sex for a more biological approach. So if you were to work in a medical company or healthcare company and you wanted to know really, on this scenario, not the gender identity of a person, but the sex, you would use that terminology. If you build a social profile, of course, you don't want to ask people about their genitals. You want to ask about their gender identity. So, transgender is not a gender. Transgender is a person going from one gender to the other. It feels always both weird and wrong to have it as part of a form, like transgender option. It's not a gender in itself. And transgender and non-binary are two different things. They are a common minority suffering from the same problem in our society, but they are, practically speaking, different things. Transgender is a person going from one to the other gender, and non-binary is a person not sticking to a binary model. More to that later. And the most important thing of all is that you don't get to decide shit about all this. Like if you can live with one thing today of this talk, is that you don't get to decide what people can say about their gender. Like, this is up to them. The only thing you gotta do is make sure your form do not prevent them from doing so. Exactly, so what? So what do we do with all that again? This is your worst case scenario. And I think we probably have all seen something like this. You have a mandatory field of gender, and then you have male and female, and be done with it. Needless to say, this is terrible. So first advice is ask only if you must. You don't have to know everything about everyone, and especially online. And if you are, I don't know, a car rental company, I would argue you don't need to know that. So ask only if you must. And this always reminds me of this webcomic, this How No webcomic. It's like, what is your gender? I need to know. Oh no. So really, ask if you must. And if you end up asking about gender, always say why. That's totally okay to ask. That's totally cool. But you have to kind of give a reason why. In this scenario, we have the same form as earlier, but we have a sentence saying, this information is required by our legal department to ensure compliance to terms and conditions. There is a bad reason to ask. But at least, you know, there is a link to terms and conditions, and there is a reason why we're asking, so I guess it's still something. Among the reasons why you don't want to ask, there's advertising. Gender-based advertising is something we really like, we've been really enjoying for the last decades, even on television and everything, and it's shit. Nobody likes that. Nobody wants to receive hand lotion commercials or shaving cream. So, like, this is a wrong reason to do that. And if you are asking about gender for declining services based on the gender of the person, this is actually illegal. And if your company does that, I seriously invite you to find another one. Amongst the reasons why it's okay, but it depends on the context, it's hard to say on a first basis like this, is building social profiles, of course, and then when you have a third party that requires this information. For instance, at N26, we have to ask about gender because our banking system needs it for savings, credits, loans, and so on. It's not ideal, of course, but you know, it happens, and it's a good time to explain why you need to ask again. So we need it because our third-party solution, blah, requires it. And a good reason to ask now is monitoring diversity. Like if you are asking about gender on your platform to see how good or bad or terrible or average it is regarding minorities and, I don't know, like women, transgender people, non-binary people, and so on, this is a good reason. A critical part of asking about gender is to be very clear about the privacy of this information. We have the same form as earlier, but we have an extra sentence that says this will remain private. This is not a joke at all. Like, this is really critical. Non-binary people and transgender people are a minority, very threatened. They are discriminated, they are attacked, assaulted, and a person, part of this minority, might decide to give a different answer based on whether or not this information will be public. So if you're building a social profile, for instance, for whatever reason, and you ask about gender, it's very good, it's critical to say that this information will be public, because this could have like really, really bad consequences for those minorities. So always be very transparent about how you're going to use that information, and whether or not it's going to be public and all people will be able to see that. Transgender, sorry, transgender is not, again, the word transgender is not ideal. It's not like man, woman, or transgender. Trans people are as man and woman as any other. So in this scenario, we replaced male and female with man and woman, which is more inclusive. So a trans man would pick man, and a trans woman would pick woman. And regarding non-binary, because we talked about it earlier, provide a non-binary option. There's no need for more than that about this information. Just provide this option. Sorry. So something like this. If you can, offer a way to skip. Here we have like preferred to say. The wording here is very free. You can say skip or not applicable or not specified or whatever else, but just provide a way to skip this information for the same reason as before. Like some people might be uncomfortable or scared to give away this information, especially if it's going to be public. So we have the same form as before with this option. And regarding that, I'm just going to read it aloud because this is a bit dark. This is a screenshot from a website I found a few years back. Can't remember where. And there's how should we address you, a lady, a gentleman, and then there's a block that finishes with, it is my own business, sir, and I bid you good day. I really like this. I always find it very funny. So yeah, provide a way to skip. Avoid the word over. Over is a very alienating word in this context. It's like man, woman, or whatever else. So really, don't provide that word. Don't use that word. However, if you can, provide some free texts, something like this. Here we have our 4 options from before, but then we have a 5th option that is just a text field, and people are free to fill it the way they want. If you need to do something with this information, if you really need to filter it, you can, of course, kind of bind some autocompletes to that. Facebook does it very well. And they don't even have options. They have just one text field, and then they autocomplete, as many as 72 different options from there. So they make sure that you can really define your gender the way you want, and they can still process and use the data later on, which is not ideal from Facebook, but it's a very clean way to ask for gender. And I'm going to just give a few words about pronouns. My first advice would be, don't try to guess. So don't try to guess the pronoun from the gender or the gender from the pronoun. They are sometimes, or most of the time, correlated, but not always. Ask which one to use. And again, Facebook does it very well here. They have this, which pronoun do you prefer, masculine, feminine, or neutral. And again, you note that they display very clearly the scope of this information, whether it's going to be public or private. So in this case, in this screenshot, the pronoun is going to be public. So again, be very clear about that. When you're building a UI, at least in English or any language that allows a gender-neutral pronoun, use it. In English, use they, singular they, as a default. This is completely legit. This is the correct way to do that, and it's being gender neutral. It's not offensive, and it makes sure that everybody is happy about it. There's the tweet I really like that say, "Hey, call people they by default. Singular they is not only right, but it also annoys assholes," which is always a great reason to do something. So if we wrap up about this. Don't assume anything about your users. You're building a product. You want your user to use it. Like this is the first thing that matters, right? If you're building a product for your investors, well, change it. Like find a company that builds it for the product, that build a product for the users. Sorry. So don't assume anything about your users. You will have users from all over the world. You will have users from different cultures, different backgrounds. Having lived different things, so don't assume things about them. Accept people the way they are. This comes back to, for instance, gender. Like you don't get to decide whether or not a person can be defined as non-binary or so. You let them decide what they want to be called. And this all matters because this is what I call IDA. It's inclusivity, diversity, accessibility, and this is really, at least as far as I'm concerned, this is the only reason I'm doing my job. It's really what matters at the end of the day. If your user can't use your products or feel ashamed or embarrassed or offended by your products, then you've lost your time. So yeah, think about it and keep building cool shit.
Thank you, Hugo. That's great.